Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. Don't look at them. Well, that's ominous? Hillary nervously chuckled as she read the lopsided words carved deeply into the wood of the peeling front door. Hillary and I, who'd both just turned 16 in the fall of 2013, had been best friends since before we could remember. Our houses were next door to each other, and our mothers discovered they were pregnant within weeks of one another. When my mom found out she was having a boy and Hillary's a girl, they, of course, instantly decided that their children would one day be married, while the romance our mothers hoped for never materialized. We were still inseparable, viewing each other more as brother and sister than potential love interests. We shared many of the same hobbies, liked the same books and movies, but the thing we bonded over most was studying the Mitchell mystery. Mr. Mitchell had been a bit of a local legend, living in near complete seclusion for the last 30 years of his life. He was only spotted publicly once a week when he would venture to the grocery store for provisions, mainly microwavable meals and vast quantities of alcohol. In the early 80s, Alfred Mitchell purchased 5 acres of land on the outskirts of town and had a new house constructed on it for him, his wife Elizabeth, and their 8-year-old twin daughters, Maggie and Marcy. Alfred had come to town to work as an engineer in the automobile factory, and Elizabeth was able to secure work as a teacher in the school the girls would be attending. They were, by all accounts, the idyllic American family. Construction on their new home was completed in the fall of 1983, and the family excitedly moved into what was supposed to be their forever home. However, shortly after the Mitchells made the move, something happened. Variations of that something were shared often on playgrounds or at parties. No two accounts were ever exactly identical, but they all contained at least one fact. On a cold night in the winter of 1983, Elizabeth, Maggie, and Marcy simply vanished. Hillary and I were aspiring journalists and were working on an article for the school paper to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the disappearances. We spent months combing through old police records and newspaper articles, as well as interviewing locals who were alive at the time, to come up with the following account of the events, which we believed to be reliably accurate. It was on a Tuesday morning that there were the first inklings of something amiss. Maggie and Marcy's teacher found they were absent when she took roll, and when she went to Elizabeth's classroom to inquire if the girls were sick, she found a room full of rowdy children, but no teacher. It was quite unlike Elizabeth to miss work without notice so that the school could find a substitute. And all 3 of them had been present on Monday looking perfectly healthy. Concern grew. The school first made several calls to the Mitchell home, but received no answer. They then called over to the factory where Alfred worked and found that he had not shown up that day either. They'd been trying to reach him too. After one more failed attempt to raise the Mitchells at their house, the school called the police to see if someone could go and check on them. What they found sparked the biggest scandal our town had ever seen. When 2 officers arrived on the property, they saw the front door was wide open, and there were fresh footprints in the snow leading to the shed on the side of the house. Strangely, they noted that whoever had made them had been barefoot. They then announced themselves as the police and called for the Mitchells. but received no response from within. Drawing their weapons, they entered the home, shouting for anyone inside to show themselves and come out with their hands up, and were met with more silence. Yet as they made their way deeper within, they started to hear something coming up the basement steps and through the open basement door. Digging. It was the distinct sound of a shovel hitting dirt, and the labored breaths of a man working. They called down the steps to who they now suspected to be Mr. Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, Alfred Mitchell, is that you?" "Alfred, it's the police. Come out now." The digging continued. Listening more closely, they heard mumblings between the strikes. No, they're down here. They're okay. Just a little further. Just need to keep digging. Just a little deeper." The police decided to head down and investigate, and when they reached the bottom, they found Alfred, who was still in his pajamas and was covered in dirt. It was clear that he had been the one who'd run out to the shed, as he was surrounded by tools, a pickaxe, a sledgehammer, spades, and shovels of various sizes. He'd used them to punch a hole roughly 3 feet in diameter through the 3-inch concrete floor, and had dug down about 4 feet down already. One officer trained his weapon on Alfred while the other approached him from behind. They both continued to call his name and told him to drop the shovel. But it was like he couldn't hear them. Manically and furiously, he just continued to hack at the dirt until the officer wrapped him up around the chest and tackled him to the ground. It was only as he hit the floor and they wrestled the shovel away from him that he seemed to even notice they were there. Wildly he screamed, "No, let me go. I must keep digging. I have to save them." Efforts to calm him were fruitless, so they handcuffed him and dragged him kicking and screaming to their squad car. All the while, he cursed them for stopping him. "You have to let me go. I can still save them. You're killing them. Let me go, you bastards." They decided it would be best to get him away from the house if they were going to question him, and waited for more officers to arrive on scene to continue to search for the Mitchell women before driving a hysterical Alfred to the station. Once there, they calmed him enough to answer a few questions by telling him that there were officers at the house continuing the search, and that they'd let him join them once he gave them the information they needed. When asked where were his wife and daughters, he responded, "Under the house." They asked, "What do you mean? They're under the house?" He replied, "They're in the hole." "What hole?" "The hole under the house." "The hole you dug?" "No." "Did you put them in the hole?" "No." "Did you hurt your family?" "No." "Alfred, where is your family?" "They're in the hole. I need to go back and get them. Let me go." Back in hysterics, he threw the chair he'd been sitting in at an officer's head, at which point they deemed the interview over and locked him in a holding cell. In the meantime, the police made calls to every Mitchell relative and friend they could reach, hoping someone might have heard from or seen Elizabeth or the girls. No one had since the previous day. Given Alfred's strange statements and behavior, suspicion of something nefarious mounted. While Alfred was being questioned, officers continued to search the Mitchell house and property for any trace of the women, alive or otherwise, yet they found nothing. Both Elizabeth's and Alfred's cars were still in the garage, so Elizabeth hadn't simply driven away with the girls in the night. And all of Elizabeth's and the girls' belongings were left behind: clothes, dolls, toothbrushes. The more they searched, the less likely it seemed that they'd left of their own volition. But there was also no evidence to indicate otherwise. There were no signs of a struggle in the house or vehicles, no bloodstains, or areas that looked like they'd gone through a recent deep cleaning. The only tracks in the snow were those of Alfred going to and from the shed. So they hadn't left on foot via the surrounding woods, as it was the only lead Alfred gave them. They radioed from the station to the house to check the basement for another hole as well as investigate the one Alfred had crudely dug. But the only hole in the basement was Alfred's. The remaining concrete was unblemished from the original build. They suspected that maybe Alfred had snapped, murdered his family, was burying them in the basement when the police found him, and was now confusing the events in his mind. But they'd eventually end up digging down another 6 feet in his hole and would find only undisturbed clay. Days, and then weeks passed and hide nor hair of Elizabeth, Maggie, or Marcy was ever found. Search parties combed the local woods, creeks, lakes. They even inspected the septic system on the property to see if Alfred wasn't lying about them being in a hole underground. Just about the location of it, nothing. No one heard from them or saw them. They had, for all intents and purposes, evaporated. After a month of searching, hope of finding them alive dwindled. Alfred was arrested on kidnapping, as opposed to murder, charges related to the disappearances as no bodies had been found. But they knew the case was flimsy at best. The only evidence against him were the insane statements about his family being in a hole in the basement. However, given a thorough investigation of the basement had been completed and the women were definitively not down there, that made him more guilty of impeding a police investigation than kidnapping. Further questioning of Alfred gave no more leads and under advisement of his lawyer, he changed his story slightly. He didn't deny that he had believed the women were in a hole in the basement and was digging down there trying to find them. But he stated that he must have been suffering from a mental breakdown on waking up and being unable to find his wife and children. A Vietnam veteran, Alfred reported that he struggled with his mental health since returning from the war. And he must have flashed back to having to dig out several of his missing comrades after they were buried under dirt and rubble by an explosion. While that might have explained why he behaved the way that he did on that day, it still didn't explain where his wife and daughters were. Now, when asked where they'd gone, Alfred would only say, "I don't know. When I went to sleep, the girls were in their beds and Elizabeth was in mine when I woke up." They weren't. With no hard evidence, no confession of wrongdoing, and no new leads, the case against him was dropped before it even went to trial. Alfred seemed genuinely distraught that the women were missing, and sobbed every time he was brought in for questioning. And while most believed he had something to do with it, there just wasn't any proof. By February of 1984, Alfred was a free man, and the search for his family was called off. Of course, that didn't stop the court of public opinion from convicting him. Alfred became a pariah in town as wild rumors circulated on what happened that night. Many speculated that he actually had murdered the women. He'd just done a perfect job of it. Others condemned him as an abuser who'd driven his family to flee. A few bitter men accused Elizabeth of running off with a lover. And then there was a small contingent that claimed Alfred was a Russian spy and that his family had been taken due to a failure of some kind. Each theory was just as valid in its invalidity as the next. Then came the supernatural suggestions, which the majority completely brushed off. But, given the natural suggestions couldn't account for 3 women just vanishing into thin air. They were the ones that intrigued me and Hillary the most. One was that Elizabeth, Maggie, and Marcy had been abducted by aliens who were looking to study the human female, and they planted false memories in Alfred's mind to make him forget what really happened. Another was that they'd been carried off by some sort of flying creature that inhabited the local woods after they went outside to inspect some strange sounds, the very sight of it having broken Alfred's brain. And 2. There were those that believed Alfred had been telling the truth when he made his initial statements to police, that his family was in a hole in the basement, as for some, they felt it was too odd a claim to make for it to be completely fabricated. Maybe Alfred made some terrible deal with the devil, and his family had been swallowed down into hell, they'd say. From our interviews with the locals, we gathered many stories about what might have happened, but nobody had any evidence to back their claims. It wasn't until we spoke with a construction worker, James Priest, that had helped build the Mitchell home, that we caught a break. This is what he told us, transcribed from a recording we made of the interview. James: "What's this for? Again? Hillary: We're working on an article for the school paper for the 30th anniversary of the disappearances." James: "I see. You're not going to make me out to be some kinda crackpot. Are you?" Me: "Absolutely not. We're conducting interviews with many people that were alive then and only plan to include the information we think is relevant to the story. We're planning to present the facts and statements we gather directly from the sources without trying to lead the reader so they can decide which version of the story they think is true." James: "All right. Just promise you'll take my words exactly as I say them, and won't try to twist them up?" Hillary and me: "We promise." James: "Okay. So I guess we need to start back in the summer of '72. This weird group bought up some land on the outskirts of town and started living in the woods. They claimed to be a commune of free thinkers that were experimenting with a new way of living. But we recognized it as a cult." Hillary: "A cult? I've never heard about that before." James: "Well, you wouldn't have. It was well before your time, and was very short-lived. The Mitchell disappearances are the only thing anyone around her talks about from back in the day. But it was big news then. Shortly after they moved in, some local pets went missing and a few teens that snuck out to spy on them told their parents that they saw them conducting rituals, chanting in Latin, speaking of blood sacrifices to their dark master." Me: "No way." James: "Yep. And this being a good Christian town, we couldn't have a group of devil worshippers living nearby. We sent the police out there with threats to arrest them if they didn't leave. And they agreed to sell the land and move on. The whole thing only lasted around 6 months, and by the time Alfred purchased that same land in the '80s, it was nearly forgotten." Hillary: "Wait, Alfred's house was built on the same property that the cult lived on?" James: "Not just on the same property. He picked the spot right where the teens had seen them conducting the rituals. The cult made a clearing in that spot, and it was the least densely wooded area on the land. So Alfred thought it would make a perfect location for the house. I asked my supervisor if we should tell Alfred why the area was clearer than the surrounding woods. But he recommended we keep it to ourselves. It would, after all, make construction easier. When we broke ground, we found some things that the cult left behind, old coins with strange symbols. A particularly nasty-looking dagger. The remnants of what might have been a makeshift altar. And most disturbingly, bones from several small animals. All of it was tossed into a dumpster and kept from Mr. Mitchell, as it would have been enormously expensive to move the location of the house after we already started work. And we felt there was no sense in worrying him given we'd cleared all the artifacts out. But, let me tell you something. I never felt right about it. That land, there was something wrong with it. Every minute I spent there, I felt on edge, like something was watching me just out of my view. And normally, I slept like a baby, especially after being on a job all day. But, the entire time that we were building the Mitchell house, I had the most vivid nightmares of my life. I kept seeing my family being burned alive, screaming in agony while I was helpless to save them. I wasn't the only one either. All of us working the job hated it for reasons we couldn't explain and were overjoyed when we finally finished. Though, I couldn't shake the pang of guilt I felt when we handed over the keys. I guess I'll say that I wasn't surprised when something strange happened there. Me. So, you think it had something to do with this cult? Do you think they came back for some sort of revenge? James. No, nothing like that. The police kept tabs on them after they left. The leader killed himself in '74 and the rest were either dead or in jail by '83. There was no reason to believe they had anything to do with the Mitchell disappearances, at least not physically. It's why I never said anything about it. Hillary. Not physically? James. That's the last I'm going to say. Like you said, let the reader decide which version of the story they want to believe. With that, we concluded the interview, excited to have a new lead. We were able to dig up some articles from the '70s that corroborated James's story, and felt we were onto something sensational. There was something wrong with the land Alfred's house had been built on. We had information that hadn't come to light in nearly 30 years and thought we needed only one more thing to complete our article, an interview with Alfred himself. However, Alfred hadn't spoken about the events of that night, or much at all for that matter, since the '80s. After his release, townsfolk would often question him during his weekly grocery trip as to what really happened, and they were never satisfied when he'd respond that he didn't know. After some time, he must have realized that trying to defend himself was useless because he simply stopped responding altogether. And, as that was the only topic anyone was interested in discussing with him, in time it became that no one talked to him at all. Only one person in town, Mr. Phillips, took pity on him and gave him a job as a mechanic where he could work quietly behind the scenes. Once a well-off engineer with a bright future and happy family, Alfred then barely made enough to cover his mortgage and booze, of which he consumed plenty, and began his long isolation. People in town often wondered why he didn't just move away. The story, while a local legend, hadn't made national news, so he was unlikely to be recognized elsewhere and could possibly start over again. While he'd let the house fall into an awful state of disrepair, the roof was sagging, the paint peeling, windows were shattered, and the gutters were overflowing with debris. The land it sat on still held value. He could sell that for a profit and have a nice nest egg for a new life. Others wondered why he didn't kill himself a long time ago. It seemed he had nothing to live for. They wondered if maybe he was afraid to see his family on the other side after what he'd done to them. But, stubbornly, he clung to life and stuck to the exact same routine year after year. Everyone watched as his health slowly declined. His teeth rotted. His hair fell out. In the last weeks before we decided to ask him for an interview, his skin, eyes, and nails had turned a sickly yellow. Hillary recognized the signs of liver failure from health class and could tell Alfred was dying if we wanted to speak with him. We knew it would need to be soon. We thought we might inquire with Mr. Phillips to see if he could leave a message with Alfred that we were trying to do a report on his story. The real story. That we had new information to share with him as well. But we were too late. After school one afternoon, we went to the auto shop and Mr. Phillips told us that Alfred had collapsed while working the previous day. He'd been taken to the hospital and had died mere hours before we arrived. He'd only just received word himself that Alfred didn't make it. We left, disappointed at first that we may not get a satisfactory end for our story. But Hillary had an idea. You know, if word hasn't gotten out yet that he's gone, we could probably sneak into the house and do some investigating without anyone being the wiser, she said. It's risky. We probably won't be the only ones with that idea. They might even send the police out to keep an eye on the place given its history. I replied, exactly. Us and Mr. Phillips are the only ones that know right now save some people at the hospital. This could be our only chance to get in there and check things out. Don't you want to get an end for the story? She prodded. I had to agree that she was right. We'd been working on the story for months, studying the case for years. This likely was our only chance to get into the house undisturbed and investigate, after a brief hesitation. I said yes. The sun was already setting. So we ran home to grab flashlights and each told our parents that we were heading to the library to work on our article. We'd done this many times before, so they raised no suspicions, and merely asked that we be back by 9 p.m. as it was a school night. And that's how we ended up standing on Alfred Mitchell's porch as dusk fell, reading the words, "Don't look at them," carved into his front door. Well, go ahead. Hillary nudged me forward, though it had been her idea in the first place. It was clear she wanted me to be the person to enter the house first. Steeling myself, I twisted the doorknob, finding it unlocked, slowly pushed the door inward, and shined my light into the entryway. The state of the interior was worse than the exterior. Empty liquor bottles littered so much of the floor that it would be nearly impossible to take a step without kicking one. And a stench of rotten, moldy food permeated the air. My initial impression was one of shock that Alfred had actually survived as long as he did. I stepped into the house, beckoning for Hillary to follow behind me, and quickly realized that the front door wasn't the only surface with words carved into it. Nearly every square inch of reachable wall was covered in foreboding phrases. Don't look at them. Don't touch them. It's not them. They're dead. The faces are wrong. Just listen to their voices. It took them. It wants this. It feeds on your pain. Holy fuck. Are you reading this? I whispered to Hillary. Yay, Jesus. Maybe he was hallucinating towards the end. That can happen to long-term alcoholics." Her voice was shaking ever so slightly. I tried a light switch on the wall near the door, but nothing happened. "Looks like he wasn't paying the electric bill. Should we keep going?" I asked. "Yay. Let's see if he kept a journal or something. I'll look for an office. You check his bedroom." She tiptoed away from me as quietly as she could across the trash-strewn floor. I didn't particularly like the idea of splitting up, but we knew our time might be limited, and the decision was already made for me. So I walked towards the steps to head to the second floor. Along the way, Alfred's carvings kept hovering into my flashlight beam, and a chill crept down my spine as I continued reading. "Don't look at them. Don't look at them." Everything in my body was telling me that we should leave as quickly as possible. But I kept forcing one foot in front of the other until I came across what appeared to be the master bedroom. Dusty photos of Alfred and Elizabeth sat on the nightstands, and pictures of Marcy and Maggie hung on the walls next to yet more carvings. Most of the phrases were repeated, but there was a new one in this room. "Tape your eyes shut." On one of the nightstands, I noticed a roll of medical tape, and surmised that Alfred must have used it to seal his eyes closed every night before bed. Something about it made my stomach turn, but I'd already made it this far. I figured I should at least try to find something we could use for the article. And I didn't need to look far. On the dresser, there was an old, withered journal that looked as if it had been read cover to cover several thousand times. I picked it up, sat on the bed, and cracked it open, taking photos of the pages as I read. The dates started in early 1984, shortly after Alfred had been released from jail. February 4th, 1984. "I'm hearing things ever since I got back to this wretched house. No one will believe me. I'm not sure I can believe myself anymore. I wish I would have written it all down as it was happening before, just so I could know I'm not crazy. Better late than never, I suppose. I'll start with the weeks leading up to the night of December 5th. As best I recall them now, the first week in the house was perfect. The girls liked their new room. Elizabeth loved the big kitchen. We all enjoyed the spacious backyard. We were so happy. Then, one night, Elizabeth said she heard something coming from the basement when she had gone downstairs for a glass of water. Said it sounded like scratching. She asked if I could go check and make sure an animal wasn't trapped down there. I went down and heard no scratching nor saw an animal. But I noticed a small hole in the concrete floor, perfectly round and maybe a half-inch in diameter. Just wide enough to drop a pen down, which I did to see how deep it went. I never heard it hit the bottom. I chalked it up to shoddy workmanship, and planned to call the construction company in the morning. However, when I went back down to check it before leaving for work the next day, it was gone. Impossible, I told myself. But I had been half asleep when Elizabeth asked me to check out the noise. I wondered if maybe I'd been partially dreaming, but the pen I dropped down was missing when I looked for it. I thought again about calling the construction company, but how could I have them inspect a hole that wasn't there? Things escalated quickly after that. Elizabeth heard more noises coming from the basement at night that I couldn't. And the girls heard them too. They'd say, "Daddy, there's scratching and tapping coming from down there. Can't you hear it?" I tried desperately, straining for any sound, but got nothing. Still, though I wasn't hearing anything, Every night I checked the basement. And every night I found the hole. It grew wider each time I saw it, eventually growing large enough that I could fit my arm into it. I reached down trying to find the bottom, but couldn't. I felt nothing but air and perfectly smooth walls, like glass. Yet, no matter how big the hole was the night before, in the morning, it was always gone. I began to wonder if I might be hallucinating or going insane. I even had someone come out and look for a gas leak. But everything checked out okay during their inspection. At this point, I forbade Elizabeth and the girls from going into the basement at all. When the hole was almost big enough that the girls could fit into it, the voices started. Elizabeth said she heard whispering coming up the stairs. She said it was telling her to take the girls down there, that it wanted to meet them. I was at a loss for what to do. I wanted to tell someone, but I didn't know who. I couldn't well report a hole in the basement that only appeared at night. My wife was hearing voices that I couldn't, and then the girls heard it too. They said it sounded nice and they wanted to go down and say hi. I didn't want everyone to think we were crazy. We were in a brand new house. Things like this weren't supposed to happen in brand new houses. I decided that they should leave for a while, at least until I could try and figure out what was going on, and I begged Elizabeth to take the girls to her mother's. But she refused to go. In fact, they all did. Her and the girls liked the voice. They said it was nice and they wanted to talk to it more. They pleaded with me to let them go downstairs. I seemed to be the only one that was concerned with what was happening and knew I at least had to try something to protect my family. I bought a deadbolt, installed it on the basement door to truly prevent them from going down there, and wore the key around my neck. I thought that that would be enough. But I was stupid. I was dealing with something I didn't comprehend, just wishing that it would go away. And it cost me my family. On the night of the 5th, Elizabeth tucked in the girls and then came to bed with me. She read a little before closing her eyes and falling asleep. Once she was out, I felt safe enough to close my own eyes and drifted off as well. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to a loud bang from downstairs and realized that Elizabeth was no longer next to me. I ran down to the girls' room and saw they were missing from their beds too. Sprinting downstairs, I saw that the basement door was wide open and felt for the key around my neck. It was still there, but the deadbolt had unlocked itself. I charged down the stairs, yelling for Elizabeth and the girls, screaming at them to stay away from the hole. But I was too late. The hole was wider than ever, wide enough that all three of them would be able to fit into it at once. Elizabeth turned to me and said, "It's okay. It's nice. It just wants to meet us," before taking the hands of Maggie and Marcy on either side of her and leaping in with both of them. "No," I shouted and ran forward to try and catch them. When I reached the edge, I looked down, but they were already too deep to see. So, I decided to follow. Shutting my eyes, I leapt forward, expecting to plummet an untold distance, maybe to my death even. But my feet landed on solid concrete. I opened my eyes. The hole was gone. I felt all over the floor for it, pleaded to God for it to come back, but it wouldn't open. Grabbing tools from the shed, I desperately started digging trying to find it. And that's when the police found me. I couldn't explain it to them. I couldn't explain it to anyone. But I knew in my heart that they were gone forever. Something took them, and it's never going to give them back. But now that I'm back home, I think I hear them sometimes. Just a whisper, or a giggle in the darkness. Are they still here somewhere? February 10th, 1984. I saw the girls. I clearly heard laughter coming from their room. I would have recognized it anywhere. Quietly, I creaked the door open and there they were, playing with their dolls. Immediately, I broke down in tears and called their names. They called back together. "Hi, Daddy." It was their voices, their sweet, beautiful voices. Slowly, they turned around, in unison, and I saw their faces. It wasn't them. The faces were wrong. The eyes were black, and the skin was pulled so tight they looked skeletal. I gasped and backed out of the room as quickly as possible. "What's the matter, Daddy? Aren't you happy to see us?" They chimed. "That's okay, Daddy. It likes it when you're scared." "Are you scared, Daddy?" I ran back to my room, slammed, and locked the door. I didn't hear them anymore. But I felt sick to my stomach. It had been so wonderful to hear their voices again. Part of me wanted to go out and try to talk to them. Was I hallucinating? They're not real. They can't be. They're gone. If you see them again, don't look at them. It's not them. February 14th, 1984. Elizabeth came to bed tonight, a Valentine's Day treat. I woke up feeling a weight beside me and momentarily forgot my circumstances. "Hey, Alfie." I heard my wife's voice speak her pet name for me and whispered back. "Hey, Ellie." I felt her hand grab mine. It was cold, ice cold. So cold that it startled my eyes open and I saw her face, the black eyes, the sunken skin. I screamed and fell out of bed. "What's the matter, honey? Aren't you happy to see me?" She cooed. "Are you scared? Does this hurt? It likes it when you hurt." Her voice was rising. "Come back to bed, baby. Give me a kiss like you used to. Don't you miss me?" I slammed my eyes shut and repeated over and over again. "Don't look at her. It's not her. Don't look at her. It's not her. She's not real." When I opened my eyes, she was gone. Was she real, though? I felt her hand. Why is it tormenting me? What is it? They say it enjoys my pain. I felt sick to my stomach again. Seeing her had been horrible. But for a brief moment, when I just heard her voice, I was happy. Don't look at them. Don't touch them. Just listen to their voices if they come back. February 20th, 1984. They all came together. I heard what sounded like plates being set at the table and walked down to the dining room to see Elizabeth sitting, the girls down to eat. I shut my eyes immediately and just listened. Elizabeth said, "Come join us, Alfie." The girls added on, "Yay, Daddy. Come sit with us." In my head, I knew it wasn't them asking for me. But in my heart, for just a moment, I had my family back. "Open your eyes, Daddy," the girls demanded. "Look at us." All three of them shouted in unison now. "Don't you want to see us? Don't you miss us? Why didn't you stop us? You let us die. Look at us." I spoke back to them. "I do miss you. I love you and miss you all so much. I'm so sorry." "That's good. It feels your pain. It feels your sorrow. It wants more." Again, when I opened my eyes, they were gone. But something else lingered. The scent of my wife's perfume. I broke down in tears again. I don't think I'm hallucinating. I still don't know what it is. But I think I'm starting to understand it. It feeds on pain and it's going to keep sending them back to torture me. Should I leave? They're not them. But if I close my eyes when I hear them, I feel like they're back for a moment. No, I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay with them. I'm going to hear my girls laugh and my wife call my name, even if it's only to torture me. I'll stay alive. I'll feed it, and it'll keep them alive for me. I read a few more entries, but they were much the same. Alfred kept seeing his wife and daughters around the house and they berated him for letting them die. But for a brief instant, he got to have them back, and it was enough that he allowed himself to be tortured by bastardized representations of them for 30 years. At some point, he started drinking to cope with it and the entries grew sloppier. In 1986, he stopped giving details of their appearances and just started penning the same phrases over and over again. I assumed that when he ran out of space in the journal, he started carving those same phrases into the walls. I shut the book, and as I did, I felt a weight press down on the bed behind me. My heart leapt into my throat. I had been so engrossed in Alfred's story that I'd forgotten that I was still in his house. At night, where he'd been haunted by the ghosts of his family for decades. "Hillary?" I desperately sputtered, hoping that she'd snuck past me when I was reading. "Who are you?" A woman's voice I did not recognize whispered in my ear. I felt her breath on my cheek. I spun around and saw black eyes, a hollow face. Elizabeth's features were recognizable from the photos on the nightstand. But the woman before me looked wrong, so wrong. Screaming, I leapt from the bed and tore for the door. From down the hall I heard the giggling of little girls. "Who is it, Mommy? Does he want to play? Where's his friend? Is she going to join us in the hole?" Their sing-song voices squealed in unison. Hillary. Where was she? I hadn't heard anything from her since I left her downstairs. "Hillary?" I shouted. She didn't answer. "Hillary, we have to go. Now." I flew down the stairs. All the while behind me I could hear the Mitchell women. "Where are you going, new friend? Stay with us a while. It's hungry. And Alfred hasn't been home for days. Don't look at them. Don't look at them," I chanted in my head as I continued to sprint through the house. "Hillary, where the fuck are you? We need to leave. The basement." I'm not sure how I knew, but something told me I'd find Hillary down there. Using my flashlight, I saw the path she'd made through the bottles on the floor to the basement stairs and charged for the door. "Hillary, don't go in. Don't go in the hole. It's trying to take you." When I made it to the bottom step, she was nearly to the edge. I was running across the floor when she turned back to me and said, "Don't worry, Sam. It's nice. It just wants to meet me." I knew what was coming next. She turned back and stepped to the edge of the abyss. I dropped my flashlight and dove, managing to grab her around the ankles just as she was trying to leap. She kicked me in the face, screaming for me to let her go. To let her go meet the voice. But I held tightly and pulled her so that she fell backwards on top of me. Thankfully, when she landed, she snapped out of it. "Sam? Sam, is that you? I can't see shit. Where am I?" she asked. "Yay, it's me. Listen, Hillary, we're in the basement. Alfred's basement. You have to get up and we have to get out of her." Now, I picked up my flashlight and grabbed her hand. As I did, my light illuminated the hole. "Holy shit, is that?" "Yes, it's the hole. It's real." And it's why we need to get the fuck out of here." I pulled her forward and towed her feverishly back up the basement steps. But when we reached the first floor, Elizabeth, Maggie, and Marcy were blocking the front door. "What's the matter? Don't you want to join us? It wants you, Hillary." "What the fuck?" Hillary screamed next to me. "Hillary, don't look at them. Trust me. Shut your eyes. And say it with me. Don't look at them. It's not them. They're dead. Don't look at them. It's not them. They're dead." We chanted over and over, and when we opened our eyes, they were gone, bolting through the front door. We ran as hard as we could all the way home, never once looking back. It wasn't until we were safely through my front door and up into my room that we stopped to catch our breaths. And I told her everything that had happened. I explained what was in Alfred's journal, how Elizabeth had shown up right behind me, how I knew that Hillary would be in the basement, and how she nearly jumped into the hole. We had the ending for our story. We knew the truth of what had happened to Elizabeth, Maggie, and Marcy back in 1983, and the torment that Alfred suffered for it. And we knew that we couldn't publish it. Our school paper would never run it. It was too, well, unbelievable. Also, we'd technically broken into the house to get the information, and Hillary had nearly died. We thought it best to keep that part of the story to ourselves. Unfortunately, that also meant that we couldn't exonerate Alfred. But we did go and pay our respects at his funeral, attended only by me, Hillary, and Mr. Phillips. It was there that he told us that Alfred willed him the house and the property, but had left the stipulation that he bulldoze the house to the ground and never build another in that location. And he did. As of this writing, the lot still sits empty. I just pray it stays that way. As for Hillary and I, we never did get married, but have remained close friends to this day. We rarely speak about the events back in 2013. We just feel lucky that we both made it out alive. Although Hillary recently told me that sometimes she has a dream. She hears a voice, a sweet voice calling to her, telling her that it wants to meet her, and to come find it. Story: Dylan's diary. Someone we didn't know tried to pick Dylan up from school today, said his elementary teacher. The guy said he was Dylan's older brother. Dylan doesn't have a brother, I said, alarmed. We thought so too, replied the teacher. I suspected something wasn't right straight away. It was this tall, lanky guy with black hair. Looked in his late 30s. Maybe even 40. He knew your address, Dylan's full name and birthday, and which class he was in. I went inside to check with the principal. When I came back out, the guy was gone. I was silent for a second as I stood facing the teacher outside the school gate. The gate separated the main road and a large playground and basketball court. Leading into the school, all the other kids and parents had left, and we were the only ones standing outside. Where's Dylan now? I asked. He's waiting for you in the principal's office, she said, gesturing for me to follow as she turned around. I walked across the playground behind her shakily, then through the corridors to the office. My 8-year-old son Dylan sat on the couch in the principal's office, still as a stone. The principal sat behind her desk, and there was a cop standing next to her. Hey buddy, I said, you okay? Dylan looked at me blankly. My Dylan was always a quiet boy. It was just the two of us at home at the time. I was a single dad, my late wife Angie, Dylan's mother died a year prior. She'd been hit by a car while cycling around a sharp bend, and they never identified the driver. I won't go into any more detail here, as frankly I'd rather not relive that period. But safe to say it destroyed me. I tried to pick up the pieces and stay strong for Dylan. Was I doing a good job? Only God knows. I received no feedback. Since then, Dylan became even more withdrawn, pretty much remaining silent until spoken to. He was seen by a child psychologist and various other members of the welfare team at school. But after assessment, they were sure he didn't have autism or the like. He could speak up when he was pressed. He was just shy and preferred to keep to himself. The cop confirmed I was Dylan's dad, then asked me a few questions. He finally told us they'd try and find the guy and to report if we ever saw him again. The principal and teacher said a few things. It was a blur. All I remember is sweating profusely with my knees shaking, trying to comprehend the fact that someone had tried to kidnap my son. Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you? Asked the principal. Dylan shook his head. I was on edge after that day. Dylan was my whole world, all the family I had left, and I couldn't stand the possibility that he could be in danger. It made me sick. Who was this bastard? Why my son? Did he know us? Or was it some random creep? I always walked Dylan to and from school thereafter, and was never late to pick him up again. Meanwhile, Dylan himself didn't seem rattled in the slightest. He never mentioned the incident unless specifically asked. At the time, I thought he was just timid and didn't want to cause trouble. A couple of weeks later, after the incident, the same homeroom teacher called me during her lunch break. She said one of the kids in her class saw Dylan talking to a man through the school fence. When she rushed out, the man was gone. When Dylan was asked about it, he said he hadn't been talking to anyone. The girl who apparently spotted him was questioned further, and she was adamant she saw Dylan talking to a tall, lanky man with messy black hair. The cops were called again, did a quick search of the perimeter of the school, but they found no one suspicious. That afternoon, I sat Dylan down at the kitchen table. I won't get angry. I just need you to tell me the truth, I said, trying to steady my nerves. Did you or didn't you talk to a stranger today at school? Yes or no? He shrugged. Getting an answer out of him was harder than drawing blood from a stone. How many times have we told you not to talk to strangers? It's for your own safety. You do understand that, don't you, son? He nodded, looking slightly afraid. I realized I had raised my voice, and felt guilty immediately, exasperated and running on 2 hours of sleep. I left him at the dining table and went straight to bed. That night, I woke at 2 a.m. and went for a bathroom trip. I decided to check on Dylan while I was at it. He wasn't in his room. I called out his name and looked around in the living room and kitchen, getting more frantic as the seconds ticked by. I checked wardrobes, corners, even in cupboards which made no sense to look in as he'd never fit in them. But I was desperate, thinking he'd been kidnapped. I went out into the street, yelling his name as I ran up and down it like a maniac to no avail. As I came back into the house ready to call the police, I looked in Dylan's room for one last check. He was sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" I asked, relieved but still alarmed. "I was here," he replied. "No, you weren't. I was looking everywhere for you. And you weren't in here. I was. Had I imagined all of that? I shook my head, feeling a migraine coming on. Just stay in your room. Okay? Don't scare me. I thought my eyes had deceived me somehow, and the paranoia was getting to me. Perhaps I should have paid attention to the fact that the window was wide open. About a year after those incidents, I heard a knock at my apartment door. I was inside doing some paperwork while Dylan was in his room playing Minecraft. I was on alert immediately. No one ever knocked on the door. We lived in a block of apartments, and friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would greet them downstairs. This meant it was likely an upstairs or downstairs neighbor who needed something. I had a few of their numbers from when we moved in, for contact should the need ever arise. But we weren't close at all. I wondered what could be the problem. I walked up to the door and looked outside the peephole. There was no one there. Odd, I thought. Perhaps I had heard something. Those random occurrences were commonplace now, and second-guessing myself was just in my nature at that point. As I walked back to my desk in the living room, I heard another knock. Something was up. I walked up to the door again. No one seen through the peephole. Was someone pranking us? I stood just behind the door and texted my upstairs neighbor, asking him if he'd knocked on the door. A few moments later, I heard footsteps upstairs. That went in the direction of the door, then hurriedly back into the apartment. I then received a text back. About a minute later, do not open the door. There's a guy with a huge knife crouching, hiding right next to your door. My phone buzzed again. Another text from my upstairs neighbor. Calling cops RN. Stay inside. I froze, as all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was paralyzed for a few seconds. When I came to my senses, I tiptoed to Dylan's room. Stay inside. Keep quiet, I whispered, my eyes bulging, beads of sweat dripping down my forehead. I had never felt my heart beat so fast. Dylan looked up and raised his eyebrows as I shut his door slowly and stood outside it, about to throw up and shit myself at the same time. We were so still that I could make out quiet but frantic talking upstairs, and more rushing footsteps. I read my upstairs neighbor's texts again to make sure my eyes hadn't deceived me. I tiptoed to the kitchen and grabbed one of my own kitchen knives, then returned to the same spot outside Dylan's room, anticipating a crazed psycho busting down the door at any second. I chanted manic prayers for safety on repeat in my head. Not a sound came from inside his room. After what seemed like years, I heard sirens in the distance and my heart rate started to slow a little. My grip on the knife handle loosened. Eventually I heard some shouting, more footsteps and banging that gradually faded in volume. "This is the police," shouted a voice. I looked through the peephole to confirm that it was a cop, then opened the door, knife still in hand. They were very reassuring, and informed us that a tall, lanky man with black hair had just been apprehended and taken into police custody. He had knocked on my door and was waiting for someone inside to open it. He was indeed waiting with a freshly sharpened knife. What was he going to do with it? To the first person who opened that door, which was going to be me. Well, if it isn't obvious, then your guess is as good as mine. This guy's name was Gregory. He seemed to bounce around from place to place with no permanent address. even traveling between states, and doing petty crimes like theft, harassment, and occasionally stalking minors. When they did a more thorough search, it turns out he had been involved in at least one gruesome murder in a different state, and ended up being given a life sentence for it, along with his accomplices. I wouldn't have wished that terror upon anyone. But these unfortunate things happen. The side effects of the psychological damage I experienced that day have never left me. However, I know people who have been through similar horrors, but never lived to tell the tale. So I looked on the bright side and counted myself lucky. Where there are sick freaks, there will be victims. The sicko was in jail, and I thought that was the end of it. But there was a different side to the story that I only uncovered 10 years after the incident. Dylan was due to leave for college, living away from home for the first time. He had grown into a tall kid with a surprising number of friends. Still obedient, but relentlessly quiet. While packing his things and clearing out his room, I found a rugged-looking old notebook at the back of his bottom drawer. Dylan's diary, said the cover. I flicked through it with no intention to pry initially, and saw that he had written and drawn in it extensively, with impressively neat handwriting. He had always been a boy of few words, so I was intrigued. I began reading from the first page. Page 1. Cody's house, 11 a.m. He has to give me back my coat. There were a few stick figure drawings. Page 2. I need a book for English class next week. Ask if Amy has one. I turned the pages, and the first few were filled with the same mundane elementary school day-to-day affairs, mixed in with a few doodles. Then I got to page 21. Page 21. Why does my dad talk so much? He won't even let me get an Xbox. And he won't let me sleep over at Cody's house. Talking back is no use. I hate him. I felt a sting, and my heart sank. I remembered that day vividly, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I turned the page. Page 22. Saw Greg today. He says he can help me get rid of Dad. I said he was lying, but he says he's done it before. It was in the news. As my mind connected the dots, I flicked through the previous pages. This was the first mention of Greg I could find. I started to sweat, but continued reading. Page 23. Me and Greg are coming up with a plan. Need Dad gone, but I almost got caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that stupid old mole rat, kept asking me. She took me to the principal's office again. I think Katie saw Greg and snitched. Need to be careful. A few blank pages, with a few in between filled with scribbles and admin-type notes to self. Then the narrative continued. Page 41. The word plan was underlined, with two drawings underneath. The first was of a stick figure kneeling by a door holding what looked like a dagger. This stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door, with its hand on the door handle, about to open the door. The second was of the first stick figure stabbing the stick man who had just opened the door. His eyes now two crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house and I showed him my plan. He said it was good and he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I got back in bed just in time. He's gonna get some tools from his house. Close one. Page 43. Greg screwed up. He's in jail now. Why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong. I don't know why. Page 44. I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the notebook, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times, and pondered what I should do. I never thought Dylan was capable of such heinous intentions. Confused and upset, I acted as if nothing had happened for a few days. But on the day he was due to leave for college, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and hooked it on his suitcase. He was ready to head to the station, standing outside the door with the suitcase and his backpack. Dylan, when you were younger, did I ever say or do anything that hurt you? You can be honest with me. No. Why do you ask? He replied. I held up the diary. He froze for a second, and I saw the color drain from his face. I won't blame you for anything. Don't worry, you know I love you very much. Son, you were a minor, and you were a victim of a very sick man. Besides, this thing is years old. I just want to know what I did wrong at the time to lead to this. And we can put it behind us. His shocked expression faded, leaving his ever-present blank stare. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Mom. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant by that, but stopped. The corners of his mouth stretched into a wide smile. Our eyes met, and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Dylan, if I were to find another one of these notebooks, I began tactfully, would I see the blueprint of my wife's murder inside? Yeah. He didn't even pause to answer. Then he gripped the handle of his suitcase and walked off down the street. That was 2 years ago now. I never forgave him. Every night I still lie awake thinking whether he was born that way, or it's somehow my fault. We haven't talked since he left that day, and he hasn't come back home. He's never tried to contact me, and I haven't likewise. It looks like he's doing well in college from his Facebook posts. He seems to have a lot of friends. So I assume he got his own place or stays with one of them. I wonder if any of them will ever find out who he really is. Wouldn't blame them if they never do. After all, I still don't know who my son is, and I raised him for 18 years. Story. Grandma's light is always on. In one corner of my grandma's living room stood a lamp that was almost never turned off. She would change the bulb every week like clockwork, waiting until the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows and filled the room. Even then she hurried, holding her breath until the deed was done and the lamp was back on. I would ask her about it once in a while. Each time she would smile softly, tousle my hair, and promptly change the subject. I didn't learn the truth until I was 13. The first time I turned off the lamp, I just wanted to see what would happen. Grandma screamed when she walked into the darkened living room, a plate of cookies falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. I could hear her praying under her breath as she raced to turn the light back on. Tears were shining in her eyes when she turned to me, her lips pressed thin. Without warning, she slapped me hard across the face. Grandma had never so much as raised her voice before, and I was too shocked to cry. She cried enough for both of us, gathering me up in her arms and begging for my forgiveness. With her face buried in my shoulder, she finally told me about the lamp. It was a ghost light, she said, ever since she and my grandpa had bought the house. Back when they first arrived in America, the spirits of the dead had plagued her. Only when her burden threatened to drive her mad did she ask Grandpa for help. She had expected him to laugh her out of the house, but he had surprised her by nodding gravely. It was he who had first lit the ghost light, and as long as that beacon burned through the darkness, she had never seen another spirit. I stopped visiting my grandma after that. It started gradually at first, missing a day here and there, but by the time I received news of her death, I hadn't seen her in over 10 years. As her only living relative, I shouldn't have been surprised when I inherited her house. Yet as I sat in her lawyer's office, listening to him read her will, I was speechless. I had a difficult time paying attention after that, absorbed as I was with the business of remembering. So much love had filled those walls. So many happy memories, as I thought of my tiny, sterile apartment in the city. I quickly made my decision. I was almost overwhelmed by emotion as I walked through the front door. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. Houseplants still cluttered the windowsills. Decorative bird plates still hung on the walls, and the ghost light still burned in the living room. Seeing the old lamp sent a chill down my spine. I froze in my tracks, the smile fading from my lips, and I couldn't help but think of the night Grandma had slapped me so many years ago. I had told my mother about the ghost light the next day, but she had dismissed it as simple old-world superstition. It was the same way when she was growing up, she told me, and I shouldn't worry about it. Still, I couldn't shake the conviction that I had finally seen the true depths of my grandma's lunacy. I ran my fingers through the fringe on the lampshade as I thought, a bloom of sadness darkening my nostalgia. Sighing heavily, I turned the ghost light off with a decisive click. Something woke me later that night. I lay in bed, listening to the darkness until I heard scratching coming from the living room. Rats were the last thing I wanted to deal with at the moment, and I rolled over with a groan, determined to ignore it until the morning. The scratching continued intermittently, constantly jerking me from the edge of sleep, and I finally had enough. I threw the blankets off me and stormed out into the hall. Moonlight flooded the front of the house, and I didn't bother turning on lights as I made my way to the living room. I knew every inch of the house, even after so many years, and I moved confidently through the dim light. I was furious at having been woken from a dead sleep, and my anger ill-prepared me for what I found. An elderly woman was crouched in the corner, her gaunt back to me. She was scratching at the floor where the walls met, stopping every few minutes to cock her head. A gnarl of dread unfurled in the pit of my stomach. I had no idea how this woman had gotten into my house, and though it was obvious she needed help, it took me some time to summon the courage to approach her. My hand shook as I reached out to gently squeeze her shoulder. I meant to ask her where she lived, who her caretaker was, but the words were driven from my mind when she turned and I saw her face. Her eyes were solid black, bottomless pits that didn't reflect the moonlight. Her jaw hung impossibly open, unhinged, and the dark tunnel of her mouth spiraled down into her throat. I had a moment to realize who she was, to recognize the familiar map of wrinkles in her face, the curls of her wispy hair. Then my grandma screamed. I shrieked, stumbling backwards away from the nightmare in the corner. My arms flailed in the air, reaching for the nearest lamp, and my hands touched the ghost light. I yanked the chain, filling the room with light. And she was gone. I never turned off the ghost light after that. After letting the bulb burn out one evening, I began changing it every week just as Grandma had. Eventually I got married, and luckily for me, my wife was tolerant of my strange fixation on the lamp. The light continued to burn, and I lived my life happily enough. But my grandson has been asking about the ghost light lately. Each time he asks, I smile softly, tousle his hair, and promptly change the subject. For some reason, I can't bring myself to tell him the truth. I think about how I pulled away from my grandma, how I thought her crazy, and I keep my mouth shut. I worry, though. I know I won't be around forever. Just as I know he will eventually turn off the ghost light. I worry that he might see me then, twisted and wrong, scratching in the corner. Story: Why I don't like small towns and everything in it. Chad was a bully. There's no nice way of putting it into words. At nearly 7 feet, he was pretty much the walking landmark of our local high school. He was leanly built, not unlike a swimmer or a track and field athlete. He would have been good looking, I suppose, had it not been for the numerous bruises and cuts that detailed his face and arms and chest. Or maybe, if my sister was to be believed, it was those details that made him good looking. I wouldn't know. I never understood Kate regarding her taste in men. The town had conflicting thoughts about Chad. Half of us resented that there was a trouble magnet in the midst of an otherwise peaceful town. The other half felt sympathy over the trouble magnet in the midst of an otherwise peaceful town. As far as we know, Chad lived alone with his sister on a small house by the edge of the local woods. These woods circled the ravine our town was named for. With no parents in the picture, they mostly lived off the fortune left by their grandparents and growing crops and rearing livestock for sustenance. This was what the sympathizers saw. Those who condemned him, however, chose to see the amount of trouble that seemed to follow Chad around the clock. Before his rise to power, the town's bullies used to pick on Chad just because of his size. The big lug, they used to call him. They would soon come to realize that Chad was never meant to be on the receiving end of bullying. There were 2 facts about him that I was certain of. First, contrary to what the overblown legends say, Chad was peaceful by nature. Sure, he sometimes cornered the snotty, stuck-up kids with the rich parents and asked for their money like all bullies did. Keyword: asked. He never forced anyone, though. With Chad, kids end up giving their money anyway, but without provocation. The only alarming thing about him was his size. Provoke him, however, as so many neighboring town bullies foolishly tried to, and a few knocked out teeth would be the least of your worries. Second, Chad was oddly territorial. Now, the woods around the ravine had belonged to his family for ages. We knew about that, and sure, people were entitled to their own privacy. I understood that, too, but he's so weird about it. I'd often wondered why nobody else noticed. A few years back, a sorority had the ill-made choice of using the ravines as their setting for initiating new recruits. Chad, a mere 10-year-old kid but nonetheless threatening, had chased all 32 members out of the woods with a spade. Then there were the tourists, the bloggers, the photographers who all wanted to see the ravines for themselves. A small-time TV crew visited the town once, hoping to film a documentary about the place, but it did not matter who you were. or why you wanted to go to the ravines. Chad would never let anyone go near it. Due to these incidents, he had become the town's sorta kinda de facto guardian. A deterrent against all the other delinquents. Budding bullies from the locale simply bowed under the silent authority of the guardian of the ravines. Now, our town was a devout, Jesus-fearing ministry. You know, the type where small children had to wear bow ties and suspenders to church, while their sisters had to wear those plain sundresses. It was not much of a wonder that the intrigue turned to curiosity, and soon after, boys began to idolize and the girls became smitten with the local bad boy that was Chad. I was different. Back then, I hated him for taking my sister away from me. I was 10 during those times. Kate, who was in the same grade as Chad, was 16. I was a little too attached to Kate back then. Our mother died when I was 1, so Kate took over the motherly role for me. I was young, but in the limited way my child brain could understand. I knew I loved Kate, so much that I started spouting such childish nonsense like wanting to marry her when I grow up. So when Kate started dreamily proclaiming things like getting to marry the wild thing that was Chad and taming him, I hated the guy with as much hatred as my childish constitution could muster. But my sister adored him. Through and through, she had taken to sitting and eating lunch with him at school. When nobody else dared to come close, she began to hang out with him more and more, and with me less and less. Chad got into worse and worse fights, courtesy of the endless pool of idiots who, for some inexplicable reasons, all developed an insatiable need to go and see the ravines. And, like I said, Chad would never let anyone go near it, even if he had to resort to beating them up. Just when I thought he'd finally burned through Kate's phonometer readings with his violence, she would fall for him even more. I was bitter with jealousy, so much that I too started stalking Chad. Everything went downhill from that point on. I followed him home one evening. If you saw me now, you won't have believed that I was such a small boy back then. So small, in fact, that any bush or tree becomes the perfect cover for my frame. I was able to follow Chad home undetected. Before I knew it, I was already way past the red zone, the mythical zone where you'd not want Chad to catch you loitering at and about, and I was staring at a tiny decrepit structure in the midst of a desolate clearing. The rumors understated the status of their house. It was nothing more than a shack. Bits and pieces of sacks, plywood and lumber and rusted steel sheets nailed together into a cubic structure. Cables tied to ends of lumber sticking every which way were tied down into pegs drilled on the ground to withstand strong winds from the ravine behind. The house creaked a lonely creak as a hollow gush of wind came from the ravines. The occasional ivy that clung to the makeshift fences swayed noiselessly. The place was empty, like civilization had upped and left it all to itself. "Ha, they're so poor," was what my vindictive 10-year-old mind could think as I surveyed the surroundings. But what vindictive elation I had simmered into an uncomfortable mush of pity as quickly as it had come. I felt sorry for Chad for having to live in a place like that as I surveyed the huge iron pot in the ground, with charred rocks underneath it. That's where they cooked their food, I thought with a heavy heart. As I recalled those times I threw food down the drain because Kate hadn't cooked my potatoes the way I liked it. So much for being raised Catholic. Then whatever downheartedness I felt for Chad's situation warped into paralyzing fear as a girl came stumbling, crawling almost, into the clearing. She was mostly naked. The torn rags which she must have used to cover herself up did nothing to conceal the bruises and cuts all over her sickly frame. She looked severely emaciated, with her bones sticking vividly out through her sallow, yellow-tinged skin. Chad came bursting out of the house, hurriedly cradling the girl into his arms. His sister. Chad looked as I had never seen before, his stoic demeanor gone, replaced by something akin to a child lost in a marketplace, unsure of what to do. "Jackie, it did something again, didn't it?" His voice cracked as he pressed his lips into his sister's hair. "You understand, right?" The girl, Jacqueline, said. She was having a difficulty in breathing and sounded jaded, drunk with exhaustion. "We've been through this. We can just call the police," Chad said, and I noted the tension in his voice. His gaze flicked towards the direction of the ravines. There was something that stood in the distance. A shack. A tool shed. Why someone would build a tool shed near the mouth of the ravines puzzled me. "No," wheeled Jackie as she supported herself with an arm around Chad's neck. "Why? I've had enough of this," Chad said angrily. He was crying mad. The pleasure of watching the man break down had worn off. It was like watching a dam fail, the surge of water seeping through in bursts. It felt wrong, off. Chad shouldn't be crying like that. "No, you listen to me. What would happen if the police knew?" Jackie said indignantly, some of the strength returning in her voice. Chad began to slowly, carefully, pull his sister to her feet, mumbling about taking her to rest inside. "You have to understand. You have to," said Jackie. "No one else would. No one will. I told you. But it should be put down. What it's done to you, what it's doing still, is something I can take. Chad, I told you, and don't call him it. Whatever he's done, he's our." "No," Chad screamed and I jumped. The sudden noise in the clearing sent birds flying off in surprise. "I won't acknowledge it." Jackie stood still, cupping her brother's face in her hands. "If the police knew, if anyone knew, they'll tear us apart. You wouldn't want to separate from Mom, would you?" The context of the conversation was lost on me. They were orphans, right? I even recalled Kate musing about being a mother, a girlfriend and a best friend to Chad once they married, because he doesn't have any of those to care for him. Kate said giddily. My thoughts vanished into the background as Jackie shifted weight and the rag fell off her completely. I saw her bottom half. It was not foreign, as I have seen Kate's when she used to bathe with me. But Jackie's looked mangled, diseased. There was blood that steadily dripped from it, and mixed with the blood was something else. It was that sight, more than anything else, that propelled my feet away. Within minutes, I was leaving an anonymous tip to the police outpost, describing what I'd seen. The police dispatched several officers into Chad's house. I could not remember walking home, and when I did, all I could see was Kate, in the security of her arms. I began recounting what I'd seen. I thanked Jesus for the angel that was my sister as she held me close, listening without condemning, while I sobbed in fear. I had no idea then that what I did was tantamount to throwing a pebble into the surface of a calm lake. That soon, there would be ripples, The police investigation had come and gone as quietly as it could in a small town. By daylight the next day, pretty much everyone knew that someone saw something unusual at the shack by the ravines. And an investigation was conducted because of it. It was during those times that the rumor began and spread like wildfire. If you were from a small town, you'd understand perfectly well what I'm trying to say. It was like witnessing a parasitic cycle. The rumors get transferred like virus through the townsfolk. One gullible fool after another. It would start with something small and inconsequential and then become something else entirely at the end of the grapevine. In turn, the townsfolk would feed ilk gluttons on these rumors they, themselves, perpetuated just for the sick, morbid pleasure in the intrigue of it. After all, a town needs its own sick legend, right? So when I first heard of that rumor, I did not fully understand it. I knew it was supposed to be about Chad and his sister. But it didn't sound anything like what I had seen that day. They had taken that detail about Chad cradling his beaten up, nearly naked sister and warped it into something else. According to the rumor, Chad and his sister had been engaging in inappropriate relations. It was only a few years after those events that I truly understood what they meant. Supposedly, the siblings were to sacrifice livestock to the ravines. And when they failed to do so, the ravine would send this monster being, the one called Mom, to punish the siblings. That's where the bruises and cuts came from. The ravine was also supposed to be the one that made Chad its guardian and gave Jacqueline her witch powers. The entire thing sounded ridiculous. Surely, the townsfolk would get bored and dismiss such an unsavory tale? That, by the next week, they'd move on to some other juicy town story? But they savored it all right. Everyone was so sure of what they hadn't actually seen. Everyone. One evening, I happened upon a backyard tea party at the Ericksons, our neighbor. The nights when curtains of mist would hang thick and low all over the town had begun. That made for perfect atmosphere for swapping scary stories. Or in that case, morbid rumors. Mrs. Erickson was a lovely lady. She never failed to give us candies on holidays. It was because of this that I could hardly believe what came out of her mouth that day. My daughter had the ill fortune to have laid eyes on that witch, and would I know? Within days she had the flu, she exclaimed to an astounded gallery of 5 close friends. Oh dear me, Mrs. Perkins heaved, a palm finding its way to her chest. And you know, Mrs. Dewey supplied, I honestly never liked that Chad boy. I don't like how he looks at me. She dropped her voice for dramatic effect. You know how teenage boys are, right? God knows what he's thinking while he looks at our daughters, at us. A collective gasp ensued. Cue nervous nods and conspiratory looks. It would have been funny had I not known the context of the situation. It is more likely that you'd be fantasizing about Chad than the other way around. Mrs. Dewey, you ugly fat fuck, I thought vehemently. Goodness, Mrs. Erickson breathed. Are we safe? Should we call the police? From where she sat, I could see the expression on her face as she said those words. There was no glint of malice or of guilty pleasure in her old wizened face. I was young, but I was at least able to tell when a person's having fun. She was not. She was genuinely afraid. My heart plummeted. These people hadn't been feasting on the rumors just for the distasteful fun of it anymore. They had come to believe their own fabrications. In their minds, Chad was some form of demon guard dog for the ravines, and Jacqueline was its resident witch. Chad has straight up stopped coming to the school at this point. And I don't blame him. Scores of kids with grievances against Chad had found strength in numbers. They had rallied under the flag of victims of Chad. I would have laughed then at how pathetic they were. Half of them were bullies that were deposed when they came foolishly challenging Chad. None of them were victims. They were worse than Chad ever was. But none of that mattered. The town had condemned him and his sister without trial. And when I heard that the bullies had taken to hunting down Chad and her sister, the budding seed of guilt in my chest sprouted in full bloom. I could hardly sleep. It was all because of me sticking my nose where it didn't belong. Then that night came, when the mist had completely swallowed the town and the skies rumbled, heralding the arrival of a storm. Kate and I sat dining in uncomfortable silence when news came of Chad's latest conquest. A crew had gathered to take out the beast and the witch of the ravines, and it disheartens me to note that at that point, it had almost become a norm, a routine, a sporting game. But this time was different. They had gotten too close. This time, somebody was sent into a coma. Someone had nearly died. Kate and I exchanged nervous glances. Up to that time, the town had been simmering with all the self-brewed doubt and fear that poisoned their minds. That news was the final nail in the coffin. Chad and Jackie didn't have much time left. It was by pure stroke of luck that the townsfolk had decided to convene right in front of our house. Marcus, the local, overzealous, leader type, you know what I'm talking about. Every village, every town, every apartment building has one, had taken the stage and began delivering some sort of rousing speech to the populace. "We will not cower, not anymore," he shouted, with the iconic fist in the air. As the buffoons cheered, the siblings had gone too far. Chad, maybe, but only as a direct response to the people who threatened him. My brows contracted as I surveyed the folks who all looked as if they had suffered firsthand at the hands of the siblings they were condemning. Jacqueline never did anything. Kate seethed from behind me. I caught her dark look as she moved closer to the window. "This isn't right. You know something, don't you?" I asked, realizing it as I said the words out loud. She met my eyes and hesitated. Outside, cheers ensued. Marcus was screaming something noble, heroic. I didn't care. I held Kate's stare as she contemplated. "I know Chad. I knew Chad," Kate muttered. "He's done nothing to deserve this." And then the baboons began to howl. Kate and I turned in unison as the monkeys outside began to move. With purpose, steeled conviction, they've decided to go all medieval against the siblings. I wish I could tell you that there were no torchlights and pitchforks as the mindless masses marched towards the ravines. I wish. Kate was the first to move. "Where are you going?" I asked, knowing fully well where she's headed. "I've gotta warn them," Kate panted as she jogged along the tree line. You stay at home." "No," I said as my tiny legs struggled against the gaps in the roots. "This is happening because of me." The guilt threatened to spill as I look on to the torches that bobbed in the misty dark. "This is all on me." "Stop that," Kate said curtly. "This is a town of monsters. Stop blaming yourself." We ran in the dark. How? I did not know. Kate would clear the way for me as I directed her to the path I've traced when I followed Chad home. On our left was the march of the townsfolk. On the right was the dense woods. Up ahead was the siblings' shack. And beyond that, the ravines. Chad sat in front of their house in a state I'd never seen him before. All my instincts screamed at me to run. Run far away from the feral being in front of me. He had his back towards us as he held a spade on his hands. The aura he was emitting was incredible, if not downright horrifying. He was a man prepared to kill. But Kate didn't see any of that. I watched in horror as she sprung to her feet and hugged Chad from behind. "What are you still doing here?" she screamed. I've never seen my sister cry like that. Not before. Not ever since. "They're coming for you. Can't you hear them? They want your blood. Go." Chad moved. For a brief moment. For one crazy second. I thought he was going to hit Kate with the spade. But he merely released a huge hand as he gently pushed Kate off him. "Jackie's not home yet. She's supposed to be home now," he mumbled, with an almost boyish fear in his voice. Kate, with all the courage I will never have in my life, stood up against him and punched him in the chest, the highest point she could reach. "You need to go. Now. Listen to me. We're friends, right? You'll listen to me, right?" And then she hit him again. And again, alternating with hitting and shoving as she bawled her eyes out. Chad didn't even seem to notice. He seemed way too distracted to notice anything else. Kate, me, the angry mob, as he looked into the direction of the ravines. "There's something wrong. She can't be out this late. It's done something again." And with that, Chad was on the wind, running towards the ravines. Kate had collapsed into a bawling mess. The mob was growing closer by the second. And even I surprised myself when I began to run after Chad. I didn't know why. All I felt was that I had to. The tool shed stood just a few meters away from the mouth of the ravine. It shook with the harrowing winds that echoed ominously from within the depths. The mist had descended like falls into it, sending an unnatural chill over where I stood. I gasped for breath, as I felt pain on my sides. I've never run as much as I did that day. Chad had reached the shed a good 10 minutes before I did. Which was unusual, because the deep, merry laughter coming from the shed was not his. Footsteps from behind told me Kate had caught up. Somewhere in our backs were minuscule orbs of lights. The dense woods had slowed the progress of the townsfolk. "Wah?" were the words out of Kate's mouth as she gaped at the shed. Chad's never told me about this before. She was cut off by a dull thud from within the shed. Flesh against flesh, chains rattling, and Chad's unmistakable scream of pain. We hadn't had enough time to think. Kate and I burst into the shed, one after the other. It was a bear of a man that I saw. He was even taller than Chad, and almost thrice as wide. He had to bend over as he occupied almost half of the shed. He was mostly bald, but the hair that he had was long. I counted 3 golden teeth from that fixed grin on his face. I noticed the missing eye. The only clothing he wore was some sort of rag tied around the waist like a loincloth. And he smelled of stale piss and sweat. Those were all the details I gathered before Kate screamed. I looked towards her and followed her line of sight to the central wooden post that held up the entire shed. Attached to the post was a horizontal beam, and on the beam, Suspended by what were clearly meat hooks were Chad and Jacqueline. I felt a warm stream on my leg as I saw Jacqueline even more beat up than I last saw her. She was on the nude. Darkened patches in her skin and numerous wounds were visible under the shed's sole incandescent lighting. It didn't take a genius to know. To tell from the way that her body swayed limply. Blood flowed freely from between her legs into the ground. My vision spun. I was looking at her corpse. "Mom," Chad whispered as if waking a sleeping infant. Beside me, Kate had thrown an arm out to shield me. Cover my eyes from the thing I can never unsee. "Mom, I'm here," Chad said with all the gentleness in the world. "I'm here now." It was a miracle how I can hear him over the giant's raucous laughter. The chains creaked from Chad's weight, from how he had hunched over. The meat hooks seemed to be latched from underneath his shoulder blades. The thought of steel within my back sent bile rising up in my throat. But Chad seemed impervious to the pain. His jaws merely opened up and down, reciting "Mom" over and over like a mantra. But he was looking at Jackie, his sister. I couldn't understand. None of it made sense. "Friends?" An inhumane growl from somewhere above. Kate had enclosed me in a protective embrace as the giant stood between us and the only exit. "You're his father," Kate muttered. "Oh, what gave us away? Our heights?" The giant chuckled darkly. He moved closer to us. I could tell from the heavy footfall that almost shook the shed. Chad was crying like a little boy now, repeating, "Mama, Mama," over and over. It was disconcerting to hear, like watching a tiny girl speak in a low, crisp baritone. He was unhinged. "Chad, your sister's gone," Kate began. But she was cut off with an even louder scream as Chad began to struggle against his bindings. I couldn't see anything but the tiny space under Kate's arms. Something dark had oozed its way into our corner of the shed. Blood. Chad was bleeding heavily. There was a loud smacking noise as flesh hit flesh again. Chad howled, in fury or in pain. I couldn't tell. Such a disappointment. The low growl rose above the noise. My entire body shook just from hearing it. Kate's chest rose and fell in panic, witnessing the very horror she had shielded my eyes from. "I will never acknowledge you, you monster." Another hit shook the tool shed. The chains slacked and tensed. Barely contained moans of pain. "I will not be spoken of in this way. You dog shit. You're only here because your sister was bent on keeping you. Bitch didn't want to abort. And you're only here because Jackie didn't want me to become a murderer." Chad retorted. I was expecting him to be hit again. But the giant, his father, merely laughed. It was a humorless, bone-chilling laughter, one that sent shivers that crept under your skin. No, she wanted me alive because she liked getting fucked by her own father so much she couldn't part ways with me. The giant slapped the backside of the corpse hanging on the ceiling. We all winced at the cold, inhumane sound of it as the man licked his bottom lip in apparent enjoyment. I looked at Chad and saw a broken man. He was staring at his father, but he might as well have been blind. Those eyes weren't seeing anything anymore. That husk left of a man wasn't living anymore. Fucked by her father? My temples throbbed as I began to vomit. I couldn't understand what was happening. I didn't want to understand. You sick piece of shit. I was released from my dark prison as Kate picked up a spade. Chad's spade. and lunged at the giant, trying to hit him with it. I collapsed in the pool of blood around me as I watched the giant swat the spade off Kate and then pick her up from the ground with a single hand on her skull. He surveyed her with curious interest as his eyes glinted maliciously. And just when I thought I broke my toy, Chad's father said, a perverted, corrupted boyish giggle deep in his throat. Kate struggled in panic from beneath his grasp. You know, the giant said, to Chad, to Kate, or to me. I wasn't sure. After a while, Jackie stopped fighting, and that honestly took the fun in it. And now, she's dead. Well, even I wouldn't fuck a corpse. Gotta know your boundaries, right? Chad began to struggle against the chain again. I could now see that he was only a few inches off the ground. If I could at least free him. Me? I like earning my food. So, the man said as he released Kate. She, in turn, started to run in my direction. But the giant stood between us. You will run, girl. I have no business with this runt here. But if you spoil the fun of it for me, he will suffer worse than you ever will. So you will run, and I will come get you. With a horrified look to me and then to the giant, Kate tuned heel and ran outside the shed. If you get out of this and manage to save your little girlfriend, the man said, addressing his son who was mostly gone at that point, then there may yet be hope for you. The giant moved for the door. I like your sister, runt. Feisty girls like her? They especially like it hard. And she's going to get it. My throat went dry as my heart dropped somewhere on the cold, uneven slab beneath me. All of a sudden, Kate was the one hanging on the ceiling. My mouth opened in one harsh scream. I couldn't hear myself. All I could see was Kate's retreating figure. Hoping, praying that God, oh God, please let her escape. The giant of a man had gone out into the night. He walked as casually as one would in a garden of flowers. My heart drummed hard against my ears. I could almost hear the blood running cold in my veins. I couldn't breathe. Soon, the mist had swallowed the two retreating figures, the hunter and the prey. I was left alone with a corpse, a broken man, and the worst of my fears. I started this. I went and did this to Kate. My reverie was cut short by a low, almost unintelligible gurgle. Free me. An infinity passed in a span of a few seconds. The seconds I took to look at Chad and swell with hope and fall into despair at the sight of him. Kate's a friend. Chad shivered. His body was shutting down. Help me, help her. It was the sound of my sister's name that made me move. It was as if I knew all along what to do. I dragged a bench around the central post so I could get a better reach on the meat hooks lodged deep within Chad's back. I don't know how I did it, how we did it, but we managed to get Chad off the ceiling into the ground. Without so much of a look backwards, he had launched himself out into the dark beyond the tool shed. It was then that I heard the footfalls again. The giant was racing back to the shed, Kate running mad away from him. She'd gone full circle to return to the shed. To save me. The fear in her face was tinged with shock as she saw Chad barreling towards her, but she did not slow down. Almost as if they had rehearsed it, Kate rolled to the ground as Chad launched himself in the air. The giant guffawed as he caught Chad's neck in the air and tossed him aside. Chad's father was almost only an arm's reach from Kate. Caw at tea. And then the giant stopped. Lodged on one of his shoulders was a meat hook. The same hook he had suspended his son to the ceiling with. Chad pulled with it as one would wrestle against a rabid dog. His father continued to advance forwards, practically dragging Chad with him. Kate had reached me and closed the door of the shed behind her, throwing her weight against it for safe measure. I was voiceless, paralyzed. The corpse behind swayed limply as the tool shed shook with the rampage of the beasts outside. The door threatened to give, but Kate held on. The noise was unbelievable as the two trashed and brawled outside. It felt like the world was ending. And then came the triumphant laughter. Deep, booming, chilling. There was a soft thud on the door. A fist. A lifeless knock. Bury her properly, will you? Not on this town. Then there was a grunt. I told you before. Take her someplace she loves. Do you remember? Kate closed her eyes as she nodded. Yes. A final thud, and then a monstrous scream. A scream that reverberated against the very earth. One that shook and crept under my skin. One that waned and waned as it got swallowed by the ravines beneath us. And then a deafening silence. 10 years later, and it was as if the town had forgotten the bully that was Chad. Nowadays, he was just one of those stories that you told children so they will eat their veggies. Or you'd get swallowed up by the ravines like bad Chad. They'd often say, Kate had moved, far, far away. She had honored Chad's request, and now Jackie rested somewhere quiet, somewhere high, somewhere far from the depths of the ravines that held her for the entirety of her life. I stayed, because someone had to remember. Someone had to continue protecting the town. However foolish, however misguided, however unworthy its people are. Someone had to continue Chad's legacy. Because that morning, 10 years ago, only Chad's body was recovered at the bottom of the ravine. Pulmonary hemorrhage. He had drowned in his own blood. I realized then why he never let anyone get close to the ravines. He was protecting everyone from the monster that lurked in it. And when I began hearing the heavy footfalls along the ravines, I knew his work wasn't done. So now, I stand vigil near the mouth of the ravine. And I tell you this, keep out. For the monster that you seek does not exist in here, or in any cave or crevice in the face of this earth. It dwells in the hearts of men. Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.